Is this better? First of all, thanks to the Wiki team for having me here. I'll start with just a 2 minutes brief introduction about who I am and where do I work, and then we'll get on to the topic. I am Ranjit, one of the co-founders and the CEO at Pratilipi. Pratilipi is an Indian language storytelling platform. So basically, we have 5 different businesses. We have Pratilipi, which is online literature. So think of it like YouTube, but instead of videos, people write stories, novels, books, stuff like that. That has about 10 lakh writers and about 2.8 crore monthly active readers. Then we also own Pratilipi Comics, which is online comics. We own Pratilipi FM, which is online audio. We own Westland Books, which is a traditional publishing house. We own IBM Podcast, which is the largest podcasting studio in India. And we also license our stories for different TV shows, movies, web series, stuff like that. So that's a small introduction so that you can connect to what I'm talking about. Now, generally, my philosophy as both a person and as founder has been that you want to keep on learning in life, but you don't always have to learn from your own mistakes. You can learn a lot from history, what people have done right, what people have done wrong. So before talking about self-publishing per se, I thought it would be better for us to look at what have been the big technological advancement in publishing in general. I think broadly there have been 3 big changes. First was, of course, the invention of printing press, a little bit of which that we spoke about earlier. The second was the invention of internet, and the third is the phase that we are going through, the invention of generative AI. So let's go back to what used to be called publishing before printing press came along. Essentially, before printing press came along, maybe there were 100 new books or 100 new titles that could be published in the first place. Because the only way to tell a story was to either write it on a stone tablet or on paper or on basically, not even paper, sorry, leaves. So everything was expensive, everything was slow, everything was very hard to access, which meant that very few stories could be told. So people who had a lot of reach or a lot of money were the only people whose stories could be shared. And then internet came, then printing press came along. Suddenly it was much cheaper, it was much faster, and so a lot more people were able to publish their stories in the form of books. Instead of having 10 books published a year, we went to thousands of books, then hundreds of thousands of books published a year because of invention of printing press. Instead of, let's say there are 1,000 people probably in the world who actually even knew how to write on a stone tablet, versus a printing press, maybe 100,000 people could operate. In fact, over a period of time, the technology kept on becoming more and more advanced, which meant that printing cost kept on going down and down, which meant that a lot more people were now able to tell their stories with the rest of the world. But more importantly, that also meant that the kind of publishing that people did, that started evolving. Suddenly we have something called newspapers, which could not even exist in the without a printing press. Suddenly we had magazines, which could not even exist without a printing press. So it's not just that there were a lot more writers, which is true. It's not just that publishing was cheaper and faster and more accessible, which is also true. But just that the way you tell those stories or the way you publish, that itself evolved significantly. And then the next big technology came on in the form of internet. Suddenly the cost of printing, so to speak, became almost zero. Like if you publish an article on Twitter or Facebook or Medium or Quora or Blogspot or a video on YouTube, it costs you very close to zero amount to publish that. Similarly, it costs very close to zero for somebody to consume that content. So suddenly there are a lot more creators, a lot more storytellers, a lot more journalists, a lot more whatever you want to call it. But it's not just that it has become cheaper and it has become faster and more accessible. It's also that what you used to call publishing, that itself has evolved. Like, let's go back, let's say 50 years back. Journalism meant that you worked at a newspaper. Like, there could not have been a single journalist. And where you got your news from when you woke up was by looking at a newspaper. Versus today, Biden decides to drop out of presidential race, the first place that we know it from is social media, not news. So even though technically Twitter is not newspaper anymore, the purpose that it's solving is still pretty similar. Similarly, let's say you go on to Medium and read an article or read a story, it may not be a book or a magazine that you used to read in the physical world, but you're still being entertained like you're reading a story, or you're still being informed like you're reading a newspaper or you're reading a magazine. So before getting to the fourth part of new technology or generative AI, I think the most important part to understand about self-publishing and its evolution is this, that as we are moving away, or at least moving from print to internet, and as we will move from internet to generative AI, it's not just that there will be a lot more creators, it's not just that it will be much faster and much cheaper and much more accessible. It's also that the way we tell these stories itself will change. So now I'll give you a couple of examples. How many of you have read or watched Game of Thrones? Only 5-10 people? How many of you have heard about Game of Thrones? A lot more people. So people who read Game of Thrones, most of them have been waiting for about 10 years, actually more than that, for the last book to come out. But because that book has to be well researched, you have to wait for 10 years for that book to come out. But imagine if R.R. Martin was a little bit more tech savvy, and what he essentially did was like what a lot of people today are doing, that every few days he writes a chapter and uploads that. You can go and read that chapter. He reads the reviews, he reads the feedback, people actually pointed out what is going well, what is not going well, and over a period of time he can co-create that story with you. This is basically what is already happening in different parts of the world in different ways. This is, for example, what live streaming actually looks like for online games or esports. And then over a period of time, you can actually collect the same thing and it becomes a book if you want. So there's a company that went for IPO just about 2 weeks back called Naver Webtoon. So it's basically online comics. It's a Korean company. So the way it started was that about 20-25 years back, comics were very, very popular in Korea, both in standalone form and in like small parts of newspaper form. Then internet came along and papers, printing prices kept on going up and up and up. So it became very, very widely expensive, which meant that sales of physical comics started going down. So he started as the first form of evolution in 2003-2004 by saying that I'll digitize these comic books and put them online. So think of this like when COVID hit, a lot of newspaper companies did this, for example, that just the PDFs of the same newspapers that you would have, right? So you have to zoom in, you have to kind of look deeper to read something. So it's still a comic, it's just a digital ebook type form or a Kindle type form. And they had some users. The problem is that what you are doing is you're using the exact same story. What you were doing on stone tablets, now you are doing with printing press. You're not evolving the format. You're not printing newspapers. You're not doing something new. You're doing the exact same thing on new technology. So it got some users, but it not become successful. Then he thought that forget about like comics for a moment. Think of how do people use mobile phones. And people generally swipe either like this or like this. So he essentially reimagined comics to be told in a serialized fashion, very similar to what happens in like, comics that come in newspapers or magazines, but adapted for a mobile phone format. So every comic is basically 30-40 panels. You keep on scrolling down, you keep on reading comics, it gets over, next week there's a new chapter, next week there's a new chapter, next week there's a new chapter. It started just like this, just in Korea, just about 20 years back. Within 20 years, the company now has about 80 crore users all over the world reading comics. The company generates about 9,000 crores in revenue now, larger than almost any comic company that you can imagine. Now it's not about Naver, it's not about comics. It's basically that when you move to a new technology, it's not going to be exactly copying what was working in the older technology, frame by frame, word by word, and just saying that now we are online, or now we are using generative AI. You have to actually rethink that what makes sense in this new paradigm. So you have to evolve the underlying proposition itself. And with all the story coming to Pratlipi and how that relates to our own experience, generally the way publishing works is that you will decide, okay, this is a story that deserves to be told, either from a writer's perspective or a publisher's perspective. Then it will take, let's say, about a year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on the scope of the book, for the book to be written. After that, there's still another month or so, for example, for proofreading, for cover design, for editing, so on and so forth. Then another 2-3 months for printing. Then another, let's say, 15 to 30 days before it reaches out to a tier 2 or tier 3 down in India. Versus on something like a Pratlipi, you can download that right now. You'll go and write a story right now. It doesn't have to be a full book. It can be just one chapter of a book. Suddenly that story is available to everyone, everywhere in the world. They read that story. Some of those are writers who have published a lot more books than you. Some of these are readers who have only read. Some of these are amateur writers like me. They will read, they will give feedback. If you decide, you can make changes. If you decide you do not make changes, and the story keeps on going. How do you monetize? And again, the same question, right? Like, you cannot do the exact same things that used to work. So typically, how do people monetize in, let's say, Stone Age, like before the printing press came along? The only way to really monetize was patronage. Like, if there are only 100 stone tablets, it doesn't matter how much money you charge. Like, either they are not going to be, Like you cannot charge in a fixed manner. It has to be that, okay, I am a king, I want a copy of a Bible or a Gita, so I will spend this much money. Like that's the only way for you to monetize. When printing press came along, on the other hand, initially at least, you could charge it a, let's say, $10,000. Like very, very rich people can now carry it. Printing costs went down cheaper. You could basically combine advertising and say, okay, the newspaper or the book now costs 100 rupees, but there are some ads. What people try to do with the internet is they try to copy the exact same models. But again, when technology changes, the format and the USP also has to change. So for something like a Pratilipi or again something like a Naver, the way it would work is that you want to maximize engagement more than anything else because people are already there on the platform. So let's start with what Naver does, for example, the comic company that I spoke about. All the comics are available for free. Every week you come on the platform, you read one chapter, you go away, you don't have to pay anything if you don't want. And the company still generates 8,000 crores in revenue. The premise is that if you really like a story, there would be some chapters of the same comic book which are right now behind the paywall. So let's say a comic has 20 chapters. 10 chapters you can come read right now for free. 11th chapter, either you wait for a week, come back, read that chapter for free, or you can pay a small amount of money to unlock that chapter and read it today. So why would this not work in print, for example? Like you cannot deliver a book and then take it back if you don't pay me, right? But internet you can do that. The book is available. If you really cannot wait, pay. Otherwise, wait and read it free. At the very least, I still have that user. He or she may not pay me today, but he or she will pay after 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. So fundamentally, new business models that could not exist in the physical world suddenly are possible because the method of delivery itself has changed. So same for Pratilipi itself. Like there is nothing on Pratilipi that is behind the paywall. Literally nothing. It's just that there are some stories which are part of the premium or the monetized program where either you can read for free, like come every day in fact and continue to read one new chapter for free, or if you want to read 50 chapters a day, then you have to be a subscriber and you can read 50 chapters. But it's not about Pratilipi, it's not about comics, it's not about Naver, it's not about printing press. The point that I was trying to make was that we are going through the fourth big shift. We went through printing press, third big shift, then through internet, and internet is still of course evolving, and now we are going through generative AI. It would probably be a good idea for all of us to basically learn the lessons from the past. And the most important lesson of all is probably that things are not going to be exactly the same in a new paradigm. So self-publishing is not exactly the same as publishing because otherwise it's not going to work out as well. You have to think of what changes can you make to the product itself, to the positioning itself, and to the way that you monetize, which is native to this new technology, which was not even possible in the old technology. That is it. Thank you.